In 1955, East Germany launched its first international airline, proudly naming it Deutsche Lufthansa, the exact same name West Germany's own flag carrier would soon claim for itself. For several years, two separate airlines, on two separate sides of the Iron Curtain, both called themselves Lufthansa. Both painted that exact name on the fuselage of their aircraft, and both expected the rest of the world to recognize them as the legitimate successor to Germany's pre-war aviation heritage. Picture an air traffic controller somewhere in a neutral European country in the late 1950s, watching two entirely separate aircraft, operated by two entirely separate governments that considered each other illegitimate rivals, both requesting landing clearance under the exact same airline name and the exact same historic branding. This wasn't a hypothetical curiosity. It was a genuine, recurring headache for international aviation authorities trying to figure out which Lufthansa they were actually supposed to be coordinating with on any given day. This should sound familiar by now. We've already told you about two German optical companies fighting for decades over the right to call themselves Zeiss. We've told you about a Soviet-occupied factory building cars badged as BMWs, while the real BMW rebuilt itself in the West. This is that exact same story, playing out one more time, in the sky instead of on the ground. Except this particular naming dispute came with a consequence none of our other companies ever had to face. An airline that loses a trademark fight doesn't just lose a logo. It can lose the legal right to land its planes in half the countries on Earth. By 1963, after years of diplomatic pressure and international refusals to grant landing rights to any aircraft wearing a name the West German government considered stolen, East Germany's airline was forced to abandon the Lufthansa name entirely and rebrand itself as Interflug. And in one of the more quietly brutal ironies in this entire series, when reunification finally arrived in 1990, it wasn't some anonymous foreign competitor that swallowed East Germany's flagship airline whole. It was that exact same West German Lufthansa, the very rival whose legal pressure had already forced this company to change its name once before, finishing the job by inheriting the entire unified German aviation market almost overnight. This is the story of Interflug, East Germany's only airline, an airline whose very identity had already been defeated once, decades before its final collapse. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the earliest days of post-war German aviation, when both German states were, for entirely different reasons, desperate to prove they belonged in the sky at all. After the Second World War, Germany's aviation industry and its airlines had been completely dismantled by the occupying Allied powers, who understood exactly how much strategic value German aircraft manufacturing and commercial aviation expertise had represented to the Nazi war machine. For nearly a decade after the war, neither East nor West Germany operated any independent commercial airline of its own. Their aviation ambitions kept firmly in check by post-war occupation agreements. Consider how genuinely severe this restriction actually was for a country that had, before the war, operated one of the most technically advanced commercial and military aviation industries in the entire world. German aircraft engineering had been at the absolute forefront of global aviation development throughout the 1930s and into the war years, and the Allied powers, having witnessed exactly how quickly that capability could be redirected toward military purposes, were determined to prevent any rapid post-war reconstitution of that same expertise. For the German people on both sides of the emerging Cold War divide, this meant watching other nations rebuild and modernize their own commercial aviation industries throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, while their own country remained explicitly barred from doing the same. As those restrictions gradually eased through the 1950s, both German states raced to re-establish national airlines, each treating the ability to fly its own flag carrier internationally as a genuine marker of post-war legitimacy and sovereignty. West Germany's reconstituted Lufthansa launched in 1955, deliberately reviving the name and heritage of the pre-war German flag carrier that had operated before the war. That same year, East Germany, equally determined to establish its own aviation identity and equally eager to claim continuity with pre-war German aviation heritage, launched its own airline and, in a decision that would prove genuinely consequential, chose to call it Deutsche Lufthansa as well. For several years through the late 1950s, this created exactly the kind of overlapping, legally contested confusion we've already seen play out with Zeiss and with BMW's Eisenach factory. Two separate airlines, representing two separate mutually hostile German governments, both operating under the same historic name, both claiming legitimate continuity with the same pre-war aviation tradition. But airlines face a particular kind of practical vulnerability that factories and camera manufacturers never have to deal with in quite the same way. And this is where Interflug's story genuinely diverges from everything else we've covered in this series. A factory that loses a trademark dispute can still, in the worst case, simply sell its products under a different name in whatever markets remain open to it. A camera or a car doesn't need permission from a foreign government to physically enter that country. An airline, by contrast, cannot legally land a single aircraft in another country without that country's explicit governmental permission, negotiated through bilateral air service agreements, and coordinated through the International Aviation System's shared identification codes and diplomatic recognition protocols. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth taking a moment to appreciate just how different an airline's vulnerability genuinely is from every other kind of company we've covered in this series. A car manufacturer facing a trademark dispute might need to repaint some badges or update some marketing materials, an annoying but ultimately manageable administrative headache. An airline facing the same kind of dispute risks something far more fundamental, the actual physical ability to operate at all in a given country, because every single route requires active, ongoing cooperation from that country's aviation regulators, air traffic control systems, and diplomatic establishment. There's no equivalent in the car or camera business to simply being denied the physical right to enter a market at all, regardless of price, quality, or demand. This meant the East German Lufthansa wasn't simply facing an embarrassing naming coincidence. It was facing an existential threat to its ability to operate internationally at all, because country after country, especially those aligned with or sympathetic to the West, refused to grant landing rights or diplomatic recognition to an airline using a name West Germany's own government considered rightfully theirs. Through the early 1960s, this pressure became increasingly unsustainable. West Germany's diplomatic and legal campaign to protect its exclusive claim to the Lufthansa name succeeded in convincing enough of the international community that the East German version simply couldn't function as a credible international carrier while carrying that particular name. And so, in 1963, East Germany's airline abandoned the Deutsche Lufthansa name entirely and rebranded itself as Interflug, a genuinely invented name with no prior heritage baggage attached to it, chosen specifically because it carried none of the legal vulnerability the old name had exposed the airline to. There's something genuinely poignant about this particular defeat, worth sitting with before we move forward. Unlike Zeiss Jena, which continued fighting for decades to preserve at least some legal claim to its original name, or the Eisenach car factory, which settled for the compromise name EMW, while still carrying visual echoes of the old BMW branding, East Germany's airline lost this particular fight completely and permanently. Interflug carried absolutely no trace of the aviation heritage its founders had originally wanted to claim. It was, from 1963 onward, a genuinely new identity, built from scratch, precisely because the old one had proven impossible to defend on the international stage. Under this new Interflug identity, though, East Germany's airline actually grew into something genuinely significant within its own sphere, becoming the flagship international carrier not just for ordinary commercial travel, but for the broader diplomatic project of establishing East Germany as a legitimate, internationally recognized state in its own right. This mattered enormously to East German leadership, precisely because for much of the Cold War, a considerable number of Western-aligned countries refused to formally recognize East Germany as a legitimate sovereign nation at all, treating West Germany as the sole legitimate German state. Consider just how much diplomatic weight East German leadership placed on this seemingly ordinary commercial function. Every single new destination Interflug managed to add to its international route map represented a small but genuine diplomatic breakthrough, evidence that at least one more foreign government was willing to treat East Germany as a real country worth doing business with, rather than simply a Soviet administrative zone with no independent standing of its own. Foreign ministries across both the Western and non-aligned world watched these route negotiations closely, understanding that granting or denying Interflug landing rights was never purely a matter of ordinary aviation logistics. It was a small but meaningful vote on the underlying question of East Germany's legitimacy as a sovereign nation, a question that remained genuinely contested for decades. An international airline flying East German colors into foreign capitals, landing at foreign airports, negotiating its own bilateral agreements with foreign governments, represented a genuinely tangible, visible form of the international legitimacy East Germany was fighting for on every other diplomatic front simultaneously. Interflug's route network reflected this dual mission, part genuine commercial airline, part flying diplomatic outpost. It connected East Berlin to the other capitals of the Eastern Bloc as a matter of basic necessity, but it also maintained a genuinely notable network of international destinations well beyond the Iron Curtain, including routes to Cuba, a close and symbolically important socialist ally, as well as a range of destinations across the Middle East, Africa, and even certain Western European cities willing to grant the airline landing rights despite West Germany's ongoing diplomatic objections. Picture a passenger boarding an Interflug flight in East Berlin bound for Havana, a journey that, in purely geographic terms, made little obvious commercial sense given the enormous distance and limited passenger volume between these two specific cities. But this route existed for reasons that went well beyond ordinary supply and demand. It represented a physical, visible link between two of the socialist world's most prominent allied states, a flying embassy of sorts, carrying diplomats, technical advisors, and the occasional group of ordinary travelers alongside its primary symbolic function of demonstrating that East Germany's international reach extended all the way across the Atlantic, despite West Germany's best efforts to keep it diplomatically isolated. Every one of these routes represented a small diplomatic victory, proof that East Germany could, despite West Germany's continuing efforts to isolate it internationally, still established genuine air links with the wider world. The airline's fleet consisted primarily of Soviet-manufactured aircraft, workhorses like the Ilyushin IL-62 for long-haul international routes and the Tupolev Tu-134 for shorter regional flights within the Eastern Bloc. Aircraft that, in their era, represented genuinely credible Soviet aviation engineering, capable of competing reasonably well against Western equivalents through the 1960s and into the 1970s. Picture the interior of one of these aircraft during Interflug's peak years, passengers settling into seats designed and manufactured according to Soviet industrial standards, flight attendants trained within the East German aviation system's own procedures, the entire onboard experience reflecting a genuinely parallel, self-contained aviation culture that had developed largely independently of Western commercial aviation norms. For passengers who had never flown on a Western carrier, there was nothing unusual or lacking about this experience. It was simply what international air travel looked like, from the perspective of someone living within the Eastern Bloc's own aviation ecosystem. But through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the same fundamental structural pattern we've now traced through every single company in this entire series began to emerge here as well, in a field where the consequences of falling behind carried particularly severe safety and regulatory implications. Soviet aircraft manufacturing, like Eastern Bloc semiconductor and automotive manufacturing, gradually fell further and further behind Western competitors in fuel efficiency, noise regulations, and the increasingly sophisticated safety and navigation systems that Western aviation authorities were beginning to require for airports across the developed world. An aircraft that had been genuinely competitive in 1965 became, by the mid-1980s, a machine that struggled to meet the noise and emission standards a growing number of Western airports were beginning to enforce, restricting exactly the kind of international route access Interflug's entire diplomatic mission depended upon. Then came 1989 and 1990, and German reunification arrived with a particular, almost poetic cruelty for this specific company. Because unlike a car factory, which could at least theoretically continue selling vehicles domestically even after losing export markets, an airline's entire business model depends on the right to fly specific routes, and reunification meant East Germany's entire regulatory and diplomatic apparatus, the very government whose international recognition efforts Interflug had spent decades supporting, simply ceased to exist. Imagine being a pilot or ground crew member at Interflug during these months, watching an organization whose entire reason for existing had been tied to a country's diplomatic legitimacy, suddenly serving a country that no longer had any diplomatic status to defend at all. The mission itself, not merely the business model, had evaporated overnight. There was no longer any East German sovereignty for an East German flag carrier to represent internationally, because there was no longer an East Germany. West Germany's aviation authorities and West Germany's own Lufthansa, the exact same airline whose trademark pressure had forced Interflug's very identity into existence back in 1963, now had direct, immediate, unrestricted access to former East German airspace, airports, and passengers. Interflug's aging Soviet-built fleet, already struggling against Western noise and safety standards even before reunification, became almost immediately uncompetitive against Lufthansa's modern Western aircraft, and against the flood of other Western carriers suddenly free to compete directly for former East German air travelers. Maintenance and spare parts, which had depended on established supply relationships with Soviet manufacturers, became increasingly difficult and expensive to source as the broader Eastern Bloc's own aviation supply chains collapsed simultaneously. Passengers who had once had no realistic alternative to Interflug for international travel now had immediate access to Lufthansa's genuinely modern fleet, along with every other major Western carrier eager to establish new routes into the newly opened Eastern German market. Interflug's financial position deteriorated with almost exactly the same brutal speed we documented with the Trabant. Formal bankruptcy proceedings began, and by April 1991, less than 18 months after the Berlin Wall fell, Interflug ceased operations entirely, its remaining aircraft grounded, its routes abandoned or absorbed by competing carriers. Its workforce of pilots, engineers, and ground staff left to find new positions within a suddenly unified, brutally competitive German aviation industry that had very little practical need for an entire second national airline's worth of infrastructure and personnel. For the pilots and engineers who had spent careers flying and maintaining Interflug's Soviet-built fleet, this transition required an almost complete professional reinvention. Western carriers operated different aircraft, different maintenance protocols, and different training and certification standards than the Soviet system these professionals had spent their entire careers mastering. Some found positions within the newly unified German aviation sector after retraining. Others, particularly those whose careers had been most closely tied to Soviet-specific aircraft systems that simply had no equivalent role in a Western standardized fleet, found the transition considerably harder, their specific accumulated expertise suddenly representing a much narrower, less transferable set of skills than it had seemed just a year or two earlier. Interflug's primary hub, Berlin-Schönefeld Airport, didn't disappear along with the airline, though. In an echo of exactly the pattern we saw at Wartburg's Eisenach factory site, the physical infrastructure survived its original operator's collapse and was eventually absorbed into a larger, reunified aviation system, continuing to serve commercial flights for years afterward before ultimately being folded into the new Berlin-Brandenburg Airport that today serves the entire reunified German capital. And Lufthansa itself, the airline whose decades-old legal campaign had forced East Germany's carrier to abandon its original name back in 1963, emerged from reunification as the dominant flag carrier of the entire unified German aviation market, inheriting, in effect, the very airspace and passenger base its old rival had spent decades trying to independently claim for East Germany's own international legitimacy. So here's where this particular story lands, and here's what makes it meaningfully distinct from every other story we've told across this entire series. Every other company we've covered lost its independence, or its market, or its viability, at some identifiable moment tied to reunification or market exposure. Interflug's defeat actually happened twice. Once quietly in 1963, when it lost the very right to its own original name and aviation heritage under diplomatic and legal pressure from its Western rival, and once more, dramatically and finally, in 1991, when that exact same rival inherited everything Interflug had spent the following 3 decades trying to build in that name's absence. There's a particular kind of historical symmetry in that outcome that none of our other 7 companies quite achieved. The Trabant was killed by freedom. Icarus was killed by a distant collapse. Tatra nearly killed itself. Wartburg's ground was claimed by its rival. Zeiss Jena was reunited with its estranged half. Robotron chased an unwinnable race. Skoda chose to disappear on its own terms and thrived because of it. Interflug's story is the only one in this entire series where the exact same rival that first forced a defeated identity onto this company decades earlier came back, at the very end, to inherit everything that identity had been trying to protect all along. It's worth pausing on just how rare this particular narrative shape genuinely is, even across a series that has, by this point, documented 8 distinct ways an Iron Curtain industrial or commercial empire could meet its end. Most rivalries, even bitter ones, don't resolve themselves so completely, with one side's original legal victory and eventual final triumph separated by nearly 3 full decades and connected across that entire span by the same underlying contest for legitimacy, first fought over a name and finally settled over an entire national aviation market. 8 industrial and commercial giants now, all built somewhere behind the same broad Iron Curtain, and 8 genuinely different endings, each one a distinct way an entire regional economic order finally met the open market it had spent 40 years insisting it could outlast. Let us know in the comments which Iron Curtain industrial giant you want us to dig into next, and subscribe because there are plenty more of these stories still waiting to be told.